Well, good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. China's new foreign minister warns of conflict with U.S., defends Russia ties. Germany warns of consequences if China provides Russia with weapons. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says his commanders pledge to defend Bakhmut. Thank you so much for joining us. China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, has warned that conflict and confrontation with the United States is inevitable if Washington does not change course, delivering a stern and wide-ranging rebuke of U.S. policies for his first press conference in the new role. Qin, who was until recently China's ambassador to the U.S., built up a reputation for being careful and accomplished diplomat while overseas, but he struck a more combative tone in his first appearance as foreign minister at China's annual parliamentary meeting, warning of the catastrophic consequences of what he describes as a reckless gamble by Washington in how it treats its fellow superpower. At the highly scripted event, Qin set the tone for China's foreign policy in the coming year and beyond, berating the U.S. for rising bilateral tension while defending Beijing's close partnership with Moscow. Ties between the world's two largest economies are at their worst in decades, and tensions soared further last month after a suspected Chinese spy balloon floated over North America and was then shot down by U.S. fighter jets. Meanwhile, China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang also says the Ukraine crisis seems to be driven by an invisible hand, and that it's using the conflict to serve certain geopolitical agendas. Speaking on the sidelines of the annual parliament meeting in Beijing, Qin Gang also reiterated China's position on the Ukraine war and growing tension between Beijing and the European Union, which has questioned China's sincerity as a mediator when it has refused to name Russia as the aggressor in the conflict. Now, further, also on this same particular issue and the same diplomat, the same foreign minister, Qin Gang, he also equated any possible future military support for Beijing for Russia's war in Ukraine with U.S. weapons sales to the self-ruled island of Taiwan. Qin said it was absurd for senior U.S. officials to be interjecting in the issue of Taiwan, which he said is a matter for the Chinese people. China's ruling Communist Party sees democratic Taiwan as part of its territory despite never having controlled it. And Chinese Foreign Minister the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, has repeatedly refused to rule out the use of force in reunifying it with the Chinese mainland. Now, Qin reiterated Beijing's long-held stance, refusing to rule out the use of force to bring Taiwan under its control. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says there will be consequences if China sends weapons to Russia for Moscow's war in Ukraine, but he is pretty optimistic that Beijing will refrain from doing so, in his words. When asked by reporters if he could imagine sanctioning China for aiding Russia, Scholz replied, "I think it will have consequences, but we are now in a stage where we are making clear that this should not happen, and I'm relatively optimistic that we will be successful with our request in this case. But we will have to look at it, and we have to be very, very cautious." U.S. officials have warned recently that China was considering providing arms and ammunition to Moscow. A Bangkok-based geopolitical analyst, Brian Berletich, says the U.S. has been preparing to wage a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine for decades. Mr. Berletich said the U.S. has been deploying military forces across the world to undermine regional peace and stability. He also adds that the U.S. has been pushing the eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, for many years and has been preparing to launch a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Ukraine's top military commanders pledged to keep defending Bakhmut when asked how to deal further with the situation of the besieged city. Zelensky said that at a meeting of top military officials, he asked the commander of the regional grouping and Ukraine's commander-in-chief how they propose to proceed.
The matter of Bakhmut became the key one at this staff meeting. I directly asked General Syrsky and Zalunji, the commander-in-chief, how they see the further defensive operations in the Bakhmut direction, whether to withdraw or strengthen defense, and our positions in the city. Both generals responded not to withdraw, but strengthen. The staff unanimously supported this position. There were no other positions. I told the commander-in-chief to find the relevant forces to help our guys in Bakhmut. We defend and will defend every part of Ukraine. The time will come and we will liberate every city and village of our country. And we will hold the occupier accountable for every shot against Ukraine.
Сьогодні з'явилося відео, як окупанти по-звірячому вбили воїна, який хоробро сказав їм у вічі «Слава Україні».
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary force warned that Russia's position around the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut was in peril unless his troops got ammunition, the latest sign of tension between the Kremlin and the private militia chief. Ukrainian military officials and analysts also reported leaders of Russia's 155th Brigade fighting near the town of Volodar, south of Bakhmut, where they were resisting orders to attack after sustaining severe losses in attempts to capture it. On its part, the Russian defense minister says Russian forces had hit a command center of the Ukrainian Azov regiment in southeastern Zaporizhia region. The ministry did not elaborate on the attack. The Wagner chief says Russia's front lines near Bakhmut could collapse if his forces did not receive the ammunition promised by Moscow in February. Now to the Bangkok-based geopolitical analyst Brian Berletich, who was saying that the U.S. has indeed been preparing to wage war, a proxy war, that is, against Russia, using the excuse of Ukraine. He also says that the U.S. has been deploying military forces across the world to undermine regional peace and stability. He didn't just say that. He also added that the U.S. has been pushing the eastward expansion of NATO for many years.
If you're being objective, it is impossible not to notice that is not what the U.S. military is doing. It is not protecting the U.S. And I saw it firsthand in Japan, a country that is supposed to be a U.S. ally. The United States is waging a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. And this is something that has been
Now let's talk to Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, also editor of the Odessa Review, joining us virtually from Kiev. Hello, Mr. Dickinson. Good to have you this morning.
Good morning. Nice to join you.
Let's begin first with the comments of the Chinese foreign minister, former Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Queen Wang, who says that concerning the U.S.'s position and concerning allegations that it's supplying arms to Russia, that how can the U.S. possibly be in any moral position to judge China when it claims that the U.S. is supplying or selling arms to Taiwan? So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Could you begin by your assessment of that statement?
Well, I think at this stage, the delivery of Chinese weapons is far from confirmed. China certainly denies this, and China is coming under considerable international pressure not to provide arms, not only from the US, but also from Europe, certainly. The Germans, the British, the French have all been very clear that there will be consequences. But I think if we talk in terms of the comparison that you mentioned between supplying weapons to Ukraine or to Taiwan or to Russia, Russia is the aggressor here. Russia is an imperial power seeking to, waging rather, an aggressive war. So supplying weapons to China would be a very different proposition to supplying weapons to Ukraine, or for that matter Taiwan, which would obviously be essentially or predominantly of a defensive nature. So I think that certainly the US would question whether that was a very valid comparison.
Mr. Wang is a man who's very familiar with the US. He was a former ambassador to the US for China, and it's been reported that he was then very soft in his tone and very diplomatic, but now he's taking on a tougher stance. Knowing China's significant influence with Ukraine, how do you think the U.S. should respond to this position? Because he's saying that the U.S.'s relations in China are in a bad place. They've never been best friends, but could it get any worse?
Well, there are tensions certainly with China over Ukraine, but I think that there's a sense in America that these tensions can be overcome. That China does not wish to get more directly involved at this stage, but China is in an awkward position here. China is the rising power in today's world, is a superpower, is the only country in many terms that can stand alongside the US, that could serve as a counterweight to the US. And so I think there's a sense in China that they cannot stand to one side on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. They must play some sort of role there, and they don't want to simply play the role of supporting America's position. So China is looking to carve out a role for itself in this conflict, to underline the fact that it is a global superpower. And if it does not stand alongside the Western powers, then it already puts itself in competition with the West, in potential confrontation with the West. But I don't think there's a room for any direct confrontations there. I think at this stage, China is still trying to find the right balance and is not looking to align itself directly with Russia. So the scope for a direct confrontation between America and China in the framework of Ukraine is quite limited at this stage.
Before I ask you what the situation is right now in Kiev, where you are, let me enlighten us, if you will, about the situation in Bakhmut. It's been reported that it's become the epicenter of the conflict at the moment. It's also been said that the Russian forces are spreading themselves too thin, and if the Ukrainian forces who are there can just dig in and wait for the new weapons to be supplied by the West, they can actually keep Bakhmut. What's the situation there at the moment?
Well, Bakhmut is actually a fairly small place. It's not a major city. It's a small city with a population of less than 100,000. It's a place that many Ukrainians actually would not have been able to tell you much about before the war. It's not a famous place, but it's become disproportionately important politically, largely because it's become such a focus for fighting. The Russians have been trying to take Bakhmut since last August, so now for more than half a year. They've been desperately trying to take this town, essentially, this small city, with some success, but very, very incremental, very, very slow success. The Russians are now getting to the point where they're close to surrounding Bakhmut, but it's not clear they'll be able to complete this encirclement. And they have, by all accounts, suffered catastrophic losses in the process. They've concentrated large amounts of forces there. So the Ukrainian strategy essentially around Bakhmut and in Bakhmut is to draw the Russians in and to bleed them, essentially, to attrit them, to win this war of attrition by inflicting very heavy casualties on the Russians. The actual possession of Bakhmut is not considered to be that strategically important, but it's become a political prize. However, Russia is advancing. They do continue to advance there. There are chances they will eventually take Bakhmut, maybe not immediately, maybe in weeks or perhaps even months. At this stage, Ukraine is saying very clearly, we will continue to defend Bakhmut, we will stay there, and we will fight. And they will continue to inflict these very heavy casualties on the Russian side. They are also suffering heavy casualties. It's a brutal war of attrition around Bakhmut for a town which is not that strategically important. So it's a very savage and in many ways desperate fight, which looks set to continue.
Of course, our sympathies, our thoughts are with the people in Ukraine who are suffering the effects of this war. In Kiev, where you are, the families who've been traumatized, those who've been displaced and left Ukraine for safety. Can you tell us now what, after over a year, and we're in the second year of this war, unprecedented, what the mood is in Kiev?
I would say the mood is one of resilience. Ukrainians have suffered an incredible amount over the past year. There have been a large number of deaths. Millions have been displaced. The trauma of the war is hard to quantify. People have witnessed absolutely terrible events, life-changing events, extremely distressing developments on a daily basis. So there's a huge physical toll and a huge psychological toll, but there is also a sense amongst Ukrainians that they must win this war, that the country needs to win, otherwise it will simply cease to exist. Ukrainians regard Russia's attack as being fundamentally genocidal, that Russia seeks to extinguish Ukrainian statehood, that Russia, as Putin often says, that Ukrainians are Russian, that there is no Ukraine, that they the Russians openly deny Ukraine's right to exist. And Ukrainians feel that realistically, unless they can be successful on the battlefield, they will lose the war. So while it's deeply traumatic for all Ukrainian people, for everybody in Kiev and across the country, there is also a sense they have no choice. They must fight on. So there is a very strong fighting spirit in the country, which continues.
Back for a moment to China. Some has gone so far as to say that Chinese influence it's so large with Ukraine that it can help to bring this war to an end if it begins to put pressure on Russia. Now, we understand that there's a cold relationship between Russia, within the U.S. and China, and not even helped by the recent incident concerning the spy balloon, as it's been alleged, but which China says was a civilian airship that was shot out of the skies over the U.S. How important is it for the U.S. to maintain diplomatic ties with China in such a way as to influence Russia over Ukraine?
Well, to play a more prominent role in this, in the resolution of this conflict, in the potential peace process. They recently released a peace proposal, which did not go down particularly well anywhere, as far as I'm aware. Certainly not in Ukraine. I didn't see any particular enthusiasm. But the fact that China moves in this direction does suggest they wish to play a more prominent role in the conflict, in solving this conflict. So a lot of that will depend on the cooperation or the partnership potentially between the Chinese and the Americans. But there is still a sense, certainly in Kiev here on the ground, and I believe in most of the Western capitals, that this conflict will ultimately be decided not at the negotiating table, but on the battlefield. That there is very little room at this stage for a negotiation, that both sides think they can still win this war. They have very different aims. Ukraine is looking to liberate its entire country from Russian occupation and feels this is essential for the country's future continued existence. Russia is keen to break Ukraine's independence, is keen to gain something from this war, to be able to save face and to be able to set the stage perhaps for further expansionist plans. So at this stage, while the efforts of China, the efforts of America are welcome, and perhaps potentially also a restraining factor on Russia's actions, the understanding is this will go down to the wire. This will be a war that will be settled on the battlefield and not the negotiating table.
Would you know whether Ukraine has problems with conscription? We know that the numbers of people that are fighting and defending Ukraine against Russia. We know that Russia has been trying to conscript a whole lot more people to join the forces and fight Ukraine. Would you know whether Ukraine has problems with manpower in its defense?
At this stage, there's no indication of major problems. There are reports of people being conscripted increasingly throughout the country. It's clearly going to become a bigger and bigger issue as the war goes on. Ukraine is suffering significant losses. But again, there was a very large volunteer movement and people going forward to volunteer at the beginning of the war a year ago. Many of them are still waiting for confirmation to go and serve. Many people were told in 2022, thank you for your readiness to serve, but we don't need you at the moment. You know, please go and wait. And also because Ukrainian men are not of military age, are not, due to martial law, able to leave the country, they have a significant manpower reserve in place. So at this stage, we're not seeing any indications of major issues. There's localized issues for various different areas for conscription, but not on a major scale. But of course, as the war goes on, if these losses continue, that will become more of an issue. It is something Ukrainians are aware of. It's one of the factors why Ukrainians feel they must make progress this year.
We also saw that Russia had to scale down the ages of those who will be asked to join its forces in the fight in its invasion of Ukraine. How involved are the women in Ukraine in defending in whatever form or manner that might be, whether in fighting or logistics? How involved are the women of Ukraine in this invasion?
Well, the women of Ukraine are very, very intensely involved, in fact, in the country's defense. First and foremost, as soldiers, there are more than 50,000 women serving in the Ukrainian military. Thousands of them, I believe, approximately 5,000 actually in frontline positions. So they are not simply auxiliaries or medical personnel, for example. They are serving in combat roles. They are serving in the fight on the fighting front. So militarily, they're deeply involved. They're also involved very strongly in the volunteer movement throughout the country, providing for the soldiers in any way they can. Some are making uniforms, providing food, providing medicines, providing support for refugees. And another key role for the women of Ukraine, I would say, because men are not able to leave the country freely due to martial law, military-age men, women involved in politics, activists, members of civil society have played a very prominent role traveling the world to lobby for Ukraine, to talk about Ukraine, to share Ukraine's experience and to serve as a voice of Ukraine internationally. So we've seen a lot of Ukrainian women, especially in Western capitals, but all over the world, acting in a sort of unofficial ambassadorial roles and promoting the country's war efforts and saying to the world, you know, we need your help, and putting across their voice.
We saw recently the flurry of visits by the UK leader, by the American leader, President Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak, who were there to visit with Volodymyr Zelensky. How has that buoyed the resistance against the Russian invasion?
Well, all welcomes are all visits are very, very welcome, I would say. I think if we look back to last year, when the first major visit was probably Boris Johnson, the British, at the time, the British Prime Minister, in April, just after the Battle of Kiev had been won and the north of Ukraine had been liberated from the Russian advance, was a huge morale boost for the Ukrainian people. And since then, we've seen most European leaders have visited Ukraine, many other leaders as well. These visits are seen as a sign of support, they're seen as a sign of confidence in Ukraine, and they're also seen as a commitment. There is a sense in Ukraine that if these people come to Kiev and stand in Kiev and are seen to be in Kiev, it's very difficult for them to then abandon Ukraine. So it's seen as a very welcome indication of commitment, especially in the case of President Biden. His visit was seen as particularly welcome because American support is so important for Ukraine. And there's a sense that, well, if he's coming here himself personally, it then becomes very hard for him down the line to then change his stance for whatever reason, whatever political reason. It was a strong commitment to Ukraine that the Ukrainian people felt was very important for the war effort going forward.
Mr. Dickinson, if you ask any Ukrainian, they'll probably say the first thing they want is the end of this war, and also Zelensky, but not under the conditions that Russia is demanding. Are there any expectations that have not yet been met on the part of the West concerning how Ukrainians feel about how this war is being treated internationally?
Well, you're quite right. That of course, all Ukrainians want peace. Ukrainians have suffered more than anyone. They are the victims of this war. They are doing all the dying. They are doing all the fighting. But they don't want peace at any cost. They don't want any compromises with Russia. They want victory. They know they have to have victory, because without victory, there is no Ukraine. So they are quite clear about that. Ukrainians are very appreciative of the support they've received from the international community, from Europe, from North America primarily, but from the entire international community. But they want to see more. There is a sense of frustration in Ukraine over the speed, in particular, of the delivery of military aid, over the incremental approach where debate takes place for months on end before an agreement is reached. And once an agreement is reached, it takes further months to actually deliver the weapon systems. So, for example, we have the agreement to deliver tanks, but a few months ago, there's still no tanks in Ukraine, or maybe one. They're coming in dribs and drabs. The Ukrainians are very hopeful of receiving fighter jets. That decision has not yet been made. Once that's made, it will take months further to complete training programs to deliver them. So that may end up being potentially at the end of summer or in the autumn months. So there is a sense of frustration over the timescales involved here, over the delays and the political debating that goes on. And a lot of Ukrainians often say, in fact, come on, you know that we need this, you know that you can't, it will be disastrous for international security if Russia were to be successful in Ukraine. So you must ultimately deliver these weapons to prevent that happening. Let's just get beyond this political debate and get to the end. Let's deliver them now and not delay. So there's appreciation that the West has been very supportive, but there is frustration and there is a desire to make things a lot more dynamic, a lot more effective.
Thank you, Mr. Dickinson, for this exhaustive discourse. Your opinions are appreciated.
Thank you.
Mr. Peter Dickinson, the Business Ukraine magazine publisher, Lviv Today, and the editor at the Odessa Review. After the break, North Korea warns the U.S. against shooting down its missile tests. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. North Korea has said that any move to intercept and shoot down its test missiles will be considered a declaration of war. Statement by Kim Yo-jong, the powerful sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, cited a South Korean media report that said the United States is planning to shoot down Pyongyang's intercontinental ballistic missiles if the weapons were test launched towards the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. and its allies have never shot down North Korean ballistic missiles, typically launched at steep angles to avoid neighboring countries. But the question has drawn new scrutiny since Pyongyang suggested it'll fire more missiles over Japan. Kim Yo-jang says Pyongyang will see any U.S. military action against its strategic weapons test as a declaration of war. Ukraine has broadened a request for controversial cluster bombs from the United States to include a weapon that it wants to cannibalize to drop the anti-armor bomblets it contains on Russian forces from drones, and that's according to 2 U.S. legislators. Kiev has urged members of Congress to press the White House to approve sending the weapons, but it's by no means certain that the Biden administration will sign off on that. U.S. Representatives Jason Crow and Adam Smith said Ukraine is seeking the Mk-20, an air-delivered cluster bomb, to release its individual explosives from drones. They say Ukrainian officials urged U.S. legislators at last month's Munich Security Conference to press for White House approval. Meanwhile, Ukraine's top prosecutor, Andrei Kostin, said that a criminal investigation had been launched into what he called the brutal and brazen shooting of an unnamed person depicted in a video shared on social media, and accuses Russia of ignoring the laws of war. A 12-second video shows an apparently unarmed man in new uniform with a Ukrainian flag insignia on his arm standing smoking in a wooded area. The man says, "Glory to Ukraine." Multiple shots are heard coming from an unseen shooter or shooters, and the man slumps to the ground as bullets appear to hit his body. The President Volodymyr Zelensky, noting only that the video had appeared on Monday, says it showed Russian occupiers brutally killing a soldier and that the killers will be found. The head of Ukraine's presidential office, Andrei Yermak, says the man was a Ukrainian prisoner of war and that the incident was part of a deliberate policy of terror by Russia. England and Wales Attorney General Victoria Prentice visited damaged Kiev in a show of support for Ukraine's war protection, or rather prosecution efforts. Prentice toured damaged buildings in areas such as Borodyanka and in Bucha. She was met by Ukrainian Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin. The two officials placed a wreath on a mass grave memorial and visited the local memorial museum.
So most of these war crimes, these horrible crimes, will be tried by Ukrainian judges in Ukraine, and it's right that that happens. One of the reasons is that because this war is very sadly still continuing, we hope that the actions of Procurator Kostin will immediately have an effect on the behavior of Russian troops. We don't know if that is the case, but we hope that is the case. And in any event, we want to make sure that we see justice done for the people who were buried in the grave just outside. It's really important. I am quite sure as well that there will come in the future a time when we have to have an international moment of accountability for the more senior Russian leadership. Quite what that looks like we're going to be talking about in our very important conference in Lviv tomorrow. Well, we have to do the work now. The evidence is literally outside and has been gathered properly. I've very sadly seen the bones from some of the people who were buried outside. I've seen them in a laboratory in The Hague some months ago now. So it's right that we do that work. We must do that work to preserve the evidence so that when it comes, these trials can be as effective as they possibly can.
The International Criminal Court is the venue where highest political and military leadership can be brought to justice on international level. Third element of our system is, of course, international tribunal for the crime of aggression. Once again, for the highest military and political leadership of Russian Federation. Because if aggression would not have been occurred, then there would be no 70,000 war crimes committed in Ukraine. That's why it's extremely important to set up these tribunals. And you will see that the work of all international judicial institutions, it will be much more fast than it was before in history. And this is a unique moment of consolidation, of unity, not only of our prosecutors, investigators, and all Ukrainians, but also all of our international friends.
The Kremlin said it was for all shareholders to decide whether the Nord Stream gas pipeline damaged in the blast last year should be mothballed. Sources familiar with the plan said last year that the ruptured Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines built by Russia's state-controlled Gazprom Gas PMM were set to be sealed up and mothballed, as there are no immediate plans to repair or reactivate them. Asked about the report at a regular briefing, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, of course, this is a decision that should be taken collegially by all shareholders. He also said the Kremlin would not issue any recommendations to Gazprom regarding the future of the undersea pipelines. Turkish opposition leader emerged as the main challenger to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in landmark elections expected on May the 14th after a six-party alliance picked him as expected as its presidential candidate. Now, the 74-year-old Kili Daroglu, head of country's second biggest party in Turkey, aims to emerge from Erdogan's shadow and oust the president after a two-decade reign that has transformed the NATO member country and major emerging market economy. Polls also suggest that the presidential and parliamentary votes in 2 months will be tight, with the opposition bloc running slightly ahead of the governing alliance. The bloc has vowed to reverse many of Erdogan's policies on the economy, civil rights, and foreign affairs in what many see as the most consequential election in the republic's 100-year history. Now let's talk to Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, public policy analyst who joins us virtually from Lagos. It's good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure to be here.
Now, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has his work cut out for him, doesn't he? On the one hand, he has China, who've ramped up their rhetoric against the U.S., which is, well, no, not unprecedented, but possibly not expected at this point. And then we have North Korea calling any shooting down of their or aggression against their testing as a declaration of war. How important is it for the U.S. Secretary of State, who champions foreign policy, to be diplomatic enough as well as being strong enough? You remember U.S. policy back in the day where it was said that speak softly and carry a big stick. I believe that was Dwight D. Eisenhower's U.S. policy. The U.S. was supposed to speak softly and carry a big stick. What do you see as the U.S.'s position concerning these world powers? Well, China, the world power, and North Korea, a power in its own right.
I'm happy you said that he has to talk strong or carry the big stick and talk softly, because the truth of the matter is, if one considers all of the things that are happening very carefully, there's a level of complacency on the side of the U.S. So on one hand, they're signing treaty. For instance, with Russia, they've signed a treaty specifically in 2010 that they called the New Strategic Arm Reduction Treaty, and that in itself, puts certain expectation on the side of the U.S. Right now, in the speech that the president of Russia gave recently, he said that they are not going to be held responsible if they do not hold on to that part of their, agreement again, because at the end of the day, it is clear that the U.S. is not standing up to their part of the treaty. So the truth of the matter is, the U.S. as the police of the world are expected to take certain stands. But on the other side, they are also expected to be careful not to be seen to be taking side or reneging on the signed treaty they've had with the rest of the world. So yes, they have to carry the strong stick, but like you rightly pointed out, they need to be very careful in the diplomatic stance they take so that they do not spark war. Because I'm sure you've heard President Trump say that if we're not careful, another world war is brewing, and we pray not that that happens to the world at a time like this.
North Korea are not strangers to making threats. They've done this over the years. That was why, for instance, former U.S. President Donald Trump went as far as to call the North Korean leader Rocket Man, because it was always threatening them with rockets, a tongue-in-cheek statement, of course. Do you think this should be taken seriously by the U.S., that it'll be called a declaration of war if they shoot down any of their test missiles?
I mean, my point is we need to tread carefully. U.S. need to tread carefully. Because you see, at the end of the day, all of those people have access to all of these terrible ballistic missiles and all of that, and one do not want to take unnecessary risks. So diplomacy is very key at this point, because at the end of the day, these people cannot be said to be very, I want to be careful the words I use now. They cannot be said to be people who should be trusted with this kind of power that they already have. And we don't want to take unnecessary risk, because that will be very fatal. And so the diplomacy and diplomatic moves at this time should be at top notch as far as the U.S. is concerned, because any mistake could be very fatal for the rest of the world.
Turkey has been touted to be, and indeed has been, a significant influence significant influence with Russia. But we see the problems they've had recently with the terrible earthquake, and now these elections, where if there's a change of guard and Erdogan leaves the seat of power, we just reported that the new government have been talking about a change in foreign policy. Now, we know how important Turkey is to the mediation efforts with Russia. How important do you think this election will be if that occurs?
It's a very, very important election. Like you rightly pointed out, they played a very critical role in the mediation so far, because obviously we need a third party. The U.S. obviously have taken a stand. It is clear that they're on the side of Ukraine. And when you're on a side, it is difficult for you to play the role of a mediator. So yes, you're right. Turkey's role is very, very important at a time like this. So we are all hoping that whatever happens, at the end of the day as regards their election, they will not change, or they would be able to still play that role of the world's mediator at a time like this, because we definitely need someone to talk on behalf of the world and to sort of, cool all the hot nerves that is flying all over the place. And Turkey, like you likely pointed out, have played a very strategic role at a time like this, and we hope that whatever happens to their election, they will still be able to play that role for the rest of the world.
And of course, Turkey also still smarting and suffering from the earthquake that has caused unprecedented damage and great loss of life. Our thoughts and prayers with the people of that country. Thank you so much, Mr. Adeyemo, for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Ram.
Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, a public policy analyst. When we return, Thesis helps Ukrainian veterans run daily errands. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Official figures have shown that the Norwegian state raked in a record oil and gas number of revenues last year after the war in Ukraine sent energy prices soaring. According to estimates by Statistic Norway SSB, Norway earned $140 billion in revenue from oil and gas. It was by far the highest ever recorded in the statistics and almost 3 times what was earned in 2021. Norway became Europe's largest natural gas supplier in 2022 as Russia cut deliveries and the Scandinavian country increased its exports. And now joining us is Ini John Mekwa, our business correspondent. Good to have you this morning, Ini.
Good to be here. Good morning.
Russia's January oil and gas revenues, now they slid 46% year over year as Western countries turned away from Russian supplies. That was expected, right?
Yeah, it is expected, and this is in spite of all the efforts of Russia. We've heard how they have renewed or tightened relationship with countries like India, like China, that are buying those cheap oil. But in spite of that, we see that they are losing money. And now another interesting thing that comes with this is the effects of there's a new sanction that came in February last month. The effect of that has not yet been captured. That is that crude that is going through shipping, the seaborne crude. The effect of that has not yet been captured.
Okay.
And also the price cap also seem not to have been captured yet in this. So that means that Russia is likely to lose even more when the data for the next set of maybe 6 months come out. We might see it as lost more. But they're also renewing ties, or it's like an unusual cooperation, because we see that UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are the biggest oil producers, crude oil producers in the world, are also buying Russia oil. You know, it brings a kind of confusion because these are the giants when it comes to crude oil production. We talk about OPEC, OPEC Plus, and all of that. So why are they buying the oil? Now, a little bit of search shows that the UAE and Saudi Arabia actually buying oil. I think from November till date for UAE, they've got about 1.5 million barrels of crude oil from Russia. That's not much, I mean, because even they export more than that daily. But they buy this oil, they say, to use for their domestic plants and power plants and things like that, while they export theirs.
Wow, so much for us to filter in. But Poland and Estonia, finally, Ukrainian migrants, this is an interesting side story.
Yes.
They are driving short-term surge in retail trade and private consumption.
Yeah, because
back 2022.
Yeah, because you would ask that a lot of people, a lot of Ukrainians have left the country. Where are they? This is where they are. And they go there and they're spending their savings. They're contributing to the economies of those countries, those European countries mostly. And it's good for those countries. But guess what? That's just for short term. Because over the long term, the savings are exhausted. They need to start making money. That means that employment in those countries are being squeezed, transportation, housing, there's more demand, you know, and these Ukrainians will have to make those money from the country of their residence, because the money they brought in from Ukraine is exhausted, you know. So in a short term, it's been good. It's been a boost, you know. Data shows there's been a boost in those trade and all those demands for those countries. But in the longer term, at this time, it's beginning to get exhausting for them, because those Ukrainians will also have to make the money that they will spend from those countries.
They never even thought they were going to stay that long.
So
exactly. That's a sad narrative to what's going on there, but it's good that that there's a silver lining in every cloud.
Hopefully.
Thank you, Ini.
Thank you for
More from Ini John Mekwa in the program Business Morning after this one. And we continue with our final story, where a Ukrainian startup prosthetics company presented the functionality of its Hero Arm bionic arm in Lviv, now producing prostheses for service members and civilians that suffered injuries due to Russia's war in Ukraine. The West Ukrainian startup Superhumans presented its first 2 prototypes during a media briefing. 29-year-old Ukrainian soldier Andriy Gilzun lost his lower arm in combat and presented his prosthetic implant to the public by drawing the Ukrainian flag. As you can see, that's him. The company calls its implant the hero arm, a reference to how Ukrainian society perceives those that fight the war. And that's it for our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine this morning. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. See you next time.